Imagine with me for a moment that your country was at war. And not just a small war overseas taking up a couple thousand soldiers in a foreign conflict, but rather an all-encompassing war that occupied almost your entire western border and took hundreds of thousands of soldiers to accomplish. Imagine that in order to get these soldiers to be willing to go to these borders and fight, you were required to pay record-breaking military salaries on top of recruitment bonuses that alone could be many multiples of what a soldier could expect to earn in a year in the private sector. And imagine that on top of all of this, in order to incentivize people to join because the casualty rate was just so high, you also had to offer unprecedented death benefits that guaranteed soldiers that if they passed away on the battlefield, their families would receive a sum that in many cases is many multiples more than they otherwise could have expected to earn if they had worked in a productive capacity for their entire lifetime. And all of these expenses, of course, were coming out of your government's federal budget. Now imagine that on top of this, not just the workers going to the battlefield, but also the workers working at home to produce the equipment for the battlefield were being paid unprecedentedly high salaries because you had such a massive labor shortage in your country owing to the war. And in order to convince people to work at the jobs and continue manufacturing the equipment for your soldiers at the front line, you had to pay them higher and higher wages, and that these people could essentially write their own tickets. And since the companies couldn't afford to pay these high salaries on their own, you also were indirectly paying for these salaries through government funds, either by forcing banks to give these companies loans at really low rates, which essentially finally comes back to the federal budget, or you were having to directly give these companies funds from the federal budget. And imagine that on top of all of this, with all of these unprecedented expenses in both men and materiel, your country was also experiencing a drastic reduction in revenue. Because not only were many of the people who bought your products no longer willing to buy them because you were at war, but even those who were willing to purchase your products were not willing to pay full price because they understood your predicament, with the net result being you were not only selling less of your product, but you were also selling it at far lower prices than you could have expected prior to going to war. So you have these massive expenses on top of this drastically reduced revenue. And imagine if, while all of this was going on, your country's government tried to convince you that not only was the economy financially doing well, but it was actually growing, and this was one of the most financially productive periods in your country's recent history. You don't have to imagine anymore, because all of those things are exactly what is happening in Russia. As Russia's economy is crumbling under the weight of their war against Ukraine, and the government with a smile and a grin is trying to convince their people at home and the international world that there's nothing to see here, no problems at all. Now, you may or may not have understood every single thing that I just listed there in very quick succession, but you don't have to be an economic genius to understand the simple principle that if you lose your income at the same time your expenses increase, you are not going to last very long. If you personally were to lose your job and at the same time were to go out and get a loan for a new home, and a loan for a new car, and perhaps even a loan for a new boat, and begin to eat out every evening and just spend and spend and spend and spend your money, it doesn't take an economic genius to figure out that you are soon going to go bankrupt. And that same simple economic principle doesn't just apply to individual human beings, it also obviously applies to countries. Now, apparently, unlike the Russian government, I recognize the basic reality that in order to keep work going, you do need to keep some revenues flowing in. So with that in mind, I'm happy to introduce the sponsor for today's episode that made this research and analysis possible, which is Incogni. Incogni helps address a problem we all face. If you ever Google yourself, you might be shocked to see how easy it is for people to find your personal details, including sensitive personal details that you would never intentionally share with a stranger. Often, all someone needs to know is your name, city, and state to pull up your private information in minutes or even seconds, including sensitive information like your home address. But thankfully, Incogni can help. Incogni helps address one of the main reasons our data is so available all over the internet, which is data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. They make it easy to remove your data from hundreds of these data broker sites. Then they help monitor those sites to ensure that your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get right to work, finding your information and demanding that it be deleted. And while the majority of websites can be caught by their automated removal service, Incogni also recently introduced Incogni Unlimited, which takes your data privacy even further by giving you unlimited access to submit links to specific sites to Incogni's privacy experts for removal. Most sites are eligible. To try Incogni for yourself, just use the link in the description and my code Warburg to get a massive 60% discount off an annual plan. Now, back to the video. The main difference between a country and an individual is that when a country has more debts than it can manage, it can kick the can down the road by doing something that for an individual would be completely illegal. The country can print more of its own currency. And so rather than going bankrupt immediately, they can instead just devalue their money more and more and more and more, and essentially keep themselves running by taking money from the savings accounts of their people through inflation. However, the same truth remains. If the fundamental principles of having more revenue come in than more expenses go out continue for too long of a period of time, serious economic consequences will ensue. There's a couple of different ways that you can hide these effects as a country. I've already mentioned one, which is inflation. But another way is if you have a large savings account. In the same way that if you lost your job, but you had a large savings account or a retirement account, you could pretend you were rich and live really large and go out and buy some things, but every day you would be drawing down on your future, and eventually the bill would come due. In the same way, a country can make themselves look more prosperous than they are by moving from a position of saving money to a position of spending the money that they have saved up over time. And with that, they can fool a whole lot of people who are only looking at what is going on in the country itself and who don't understand what is going on behind the scenes in the balance sheets. That is exactly what Russia has been doing for the past 3.5 years. For 3.5 years, Russia has fooled a lot of the world, and especially their own people, into thinking that not only can they financially support what's going on in Ukraine for an extended period of time, but actually that they're being able to financially prosper in spite of, or perhaps even because of it. And in doing this, Russia has convinced literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, to subdue their basic common sense that expenses cannot exceed income for an exaggerated period of time without creating serious financial repercussions inside of your economy. But for every day that Russia continues to fool people that this is the case, Russia gets closer and closer to realizing the ultimate outcome of everything they've been doing. And for every day this goes on, that ultimate outcome gets worse and worse and worse and worse. When Russia started this war against Ukraine, they had quite a large savings account, measured in the multiple hundreds of billions of dollars. But now by some measures, people are saying that that savings account is perhaps only 10 or 15% remaining. And when that savings account gets lower and lower and lower and lower, the financial repercussions inside of Russia will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Russia can continue to sustain itself for some time by inflating their currency, but even that is a can that they can only kick down the road for so long. In other words, Russia's economy is extremely weak. It is built on an extremely shaky foundation. And we are now seeing some very serious cracks beginning to form. For the first time since the war began, and probably at great risk to himself and his family, the economic minister of Russia has actually used the R word, recession, warning that if things in Russia don't change soon and get brought under control, Russia will indeed experience a recession, and that the results of this could be catastrophic for the average Russian. This, of course, has been angrily disputed by Vladimir Putin, who is very intent on ensuring that this doesn't happen in order to save face among the Russian people and basically in order to save his own position. But when you contrast the words of Vladimir Putin now and the severity he is implying is going on in the Russian economy now, to his words before the war in Ukraine, you realize that even he himself knows that Russia is really in critical condition, especially from an economic standpoint. Because prior to Russia's war against Ukraine, when Russia faced a large, but nowhere near as large as this, economic crisis, where real incomes in Russia were falling by around 4% and people were struggling to buy food, Vladimir Putin made a very public show to try to show himself as competent, ordering his government to basically solve the issue. At that time, Putin was more than willing to acknowledge the real financial pain that was caused by a comparatively small financial issue. But of course, now that Russia is at war, and Vladimir Putin needs to keep his people supporting him and supporting that war, his tune has changed. However, no matter how much politicians change their tunes, no matter how much politicians change their narratives, the underlying facts and the ultimate results of those underlying facts remain the same. And what we see is that Russia's economy cannot last forever. Now, there are several new symptoms that verify what I'm saying beyond just a common sense analysis of what should be common sense economics. And one of the latest symptoms comes from a statement from a representative of the largest bank in Russia that is responsible for 60% of all new investment projects in the entire country. And recently at this same conference, the one where the economic minister of Russia said that the country was on the verge of a recession, and where Vladimir Putin tried to act very strong about the nature of the economy and its possibilities for future growth, a representative of this bank said that even though they typically represent 60% of all major investment projects in Russia, over the past year, they have not financed a single new project. And to corroborate that, at the same time, steel consumption in Russia has dropped drastically over the past year. At the same time that there are no new investment projects going on in Russia, you have the president of Russia claiming that their GDP is growing, which is essentially impossible, at least in real terms. The GDP might be able to grow in fictitious terms, in terms that don't really matter. But if there is no actual major investment going on in the country, if consumption of basic investment materials, basic construction materials is not happening, it's very clear what direction the country is actually going. What is happening in Russia is not just one single economic problem that can be easily resolved, but rather what is happening to Russia is a huge array of different economic problems that are all coalescing with increasing speed at the same exact time. For one, Russia is facing this labor shortage that I already talked about earlier, where they are being forced to pay workers higher wages than they ever have before. And a lot of people might say, well, that's not really a problem. That's actually a really great thing. But in reality, it is a massive problem for Russia because these high salaries are mostly concentrated in the defense sector of Russia. What that means is that workers are increasingly leaving their regular jobs that can't afford to compete with the defense industry to work for the defense industry instead. And that is robbing regular companies within Russia of the employees that they need to continue their operations at the same time that they already have so many international problems when it comes to trade. That's causing a lot of Russian companies to have to basically over-leverage themselves or completely shut down. And the longer it goes on, more and more companies in Russia will shut down. And what that means is that after the war in Ukraine ends, when these defense sector jobs go away, and these workers go from having these extremely high wages to going to look for new employment now that the gravy train is over, they're going to find that a lot of the jobs that existed don't exist anymore, and many, if not most of them, will not have employers to go back to. What that means is that Russia, even though they have a massive labor shortage today, they will likely have a massive unemployment crisis in the coming years. And that's just one problem that Russia is facing. Russia is also facing some basic problems that are causing a lot of these other issues. One of them being Dutch disease, where Russia has been over-reliant for decades on energy revenues from oil and natural gas to prop up the majority of their economy. And famously, it was a similar thing that ultimately helped to bring down the Soviet Union. At the time when oil and gas prices were really high, the Soviet Union was able to earn extremely high incomes. But once oil and gas revenues dropped, they couldn't keep up, and a lot of people lost their jobs, and not only those who worked in the oil and gas sectors, but also within the other industries within Russia as well, who depended on the incomes coming from the oil and gas sectors to pay for their own incomes. Now, currently in Russia, they've been sort of lucky as far as the people go and not having to experience all these results. But that is in large part due to the money that is flowing in from the defense industry coming from the savings account that Russia built up prior to the war, as well as the high inflation and the new money that is being printed and flowing into the Russian economy. This is creating a sort of artificial stimulus that is helping to replace the revenues that typically would come from oil and gas to the average Russian citizen. But it is inherently unsustainable. And so in the same way that people who are having really high-paying jobs due to the labor shortage now are going to face an unemployment crisis in the future, people within Russia who are used to the stability that is coming from military salaries will eventually reach the point where the bottom falls out from beneath their feet, and the lifestyle they got used to will no longer exist, a multifaceted problem. There are other economic problems Russia is facing too. I could, for example, mention the brain drain, where many of Russia's best, most talented employees have fled or are fleeing the country to get jobs in other countries that are more stable under governments that are more worthy of their hard work and their talents, making it impossible for Russia to recover at an accelerated pace because everybody who knows how to build industry and solve complex problems is leaving the country. I could also mention the banking problems within Russia that could eventually lead to bank runs if the Russian people figure out what's going on at a large scale. Russia, of course, in addition to its large savings account they built up prior to the war, has been financing their defense spending in large part by forcing private sector banks to lend to defense contractors at horrible terms, with rates that are below market rates and with risks that are high above average risks. This has reduced the amount of capital that banks actually have, and a lot of these loans are never going to be repaid, as after the war concludes, these companies will simply go out of business instead of paying the loans back to the banks. This puts banks in an over-leveraged position where they probably will not be able to pay back to Russians, the average Russian person, the amount of money that has been deposited with them for safekeeping. All of this on top of the fact that there is also large inflation happening in Russia. Even official levels putting this close to 10%, although when you do the math, you realize it's probably actually much higher, because Russia has an interest rate sitting around 20% that has been there for quite a long time. And if you don't understand the significance of a 20% interest rate, here in the United States, when we went from 3.5% loans to approximately 7% loans for home mortgages, the cost of an average mortgage basically doubled. So imagine going from 7% to 20%, and you'll realize how it is basically impossible for the average Russian to purchase anything on credit, which in and of itself will drastically reduce economic activity because people just aren't going to be willing to buy things. So they can't buy things at the same time that the money in their bank accounts is becoming more and more worthless every day due to inflation. And you realize Russia has a very serious problem. Now, undoubtedly, there are additional problems with the Russian economy that I haven't even mentioned in this video. That's just how broad and deep the issues with the Russian economy really are. And the really sad thing is that all of it is completely unnecessary. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, they were gaining a more and more well-respected position on the world stage. They were building large gas pipelines to Europe and getting a lot of money from contracts to Europe. They were getting closer with China at the same time, and hopefully, potentially, in the future, being able to secure future energy agreements with them. Russia had the ability to grow its economy. It had the ability to grow its revenues. But now that they've gone to war with Ukraine, all those options have gone away. Europe is obviously not purchasing from them except where absolutely necessary, and China has been really unwilling to build further pipeline infrastructure into Siberia to purchase more energy from Russia for a lot of reasons I've discussed in other videos. So Russia has self-inflicted all of these problems that they're facing and has thrown away legitimate opportunities for economic growth, all because they preferred to go to war and have the veneer of economic growth that was inherently unsustainable. Russia had their own field, which, if worked, would provide more than enough for them, more than enough to satisfy their needs, wants, and desires. But instead of working their own field, they instead chose to try to steal from their neighbor's field. Now we see the outcome of all of that. And perhaps in that, there's a good lesson, not just from an international geopolitical standpoint, but also from a moral, personal standpoint. That said, I could go on and on about what's going on in the Russian economy, but I should close this video. However, before I do that, if I could ask you for a quick favor. All of these videos are supported in large part by members of my community, like you. So if you enjoyed this video and this analysis, and you want to help support my work, you can do so by becoming a patron. It's completely voluntary, nothing's going behind a paywall. It's just for people who want to support the channel to have a way to do so. So go ahead and scan the QR code on screen, or follow the link in the description of this video, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.